And now, marine weather around Alaska.
For tonight, we've got that low tracking pretty rapidly northward here and then weakening as it tracks up to around Denali Park sometime late tonight or by early tomorrow. And strong winds, precipitation here in the form of rain, snow, freezing drizzle. Any of the three there, or four, extending along southern Alaska. Windy into the Copper River Basin, which will limit the precipitation there to some extent. Wet and windy over the southeast coast. And for tomorrow, system weakens here over the Yukon Delta, but quite an area of snow from the eastern Arctic coast southwestward into the northern Bering Sea, but winds a lot lighter here across southern Alaska. Still a little breezy there for the passes of the western Brooks Range. And this front moving through the Panhandle, less wind tomorrow and rain changing to more showery conditions during the afternoon hours. And then for Wednesday, here's the next system down here to the south coming onto the picture. So late in the day, wind and rain increasing once again for Kodiak Island. And this low will track northward and make landfall somewhere along the western North Gulf Coast, probably later on Friday, the way it looks at this point in time. And for the coastal water forecast, southeast winds 20 to 35 knots tonight. Otherwise, for the north coast, or for tomorrow, for the north coast, south to southeast winds 20 knots. Southeast 35 knots for the day Tuesday for Clarence Strait. So gale warnings there with 12-foot seas. Otherwise, Stevens Passage southeast at 20, south at 10 for Lynn Canal. And then we've got back to gale warnings with the next system coming up late in the afternoon. These winds will all be increasing to these values in the afternoon hours toward evening from the east and southeast, 30 to 40 knots. Gale warnings come back into the Stevens Passage and Clarence Strait area, southeast 35 there, southeast 25 for Lynn Canal. And for the North Gulf Coast, Cook Inlet, southern Cook Inlet, Kamishak Bay, Barren Islands, Prince William Sound, all those areas tomorrow, south winds 30 knots. And for northern Cook Inlet, south winds 35 knots. So gale warnings for the northern inlet there, north of Calgon Island. And then for Wednesday, swinging around to the north at 30 knots for northern Cook Inlet, northerly gales for southern Cook Inlet, and east winds at 45 knots for Kamishak Bay. East of 55 knots for the Barren Islands. Good storm warnings there, 24-foot seas. 30-knot east winds in store for Prince William Sound, and storm warnings for the North Gulf Coast for east winds of 50 knots. And Kodiak Island tomorrow, south winds 30 knots. And for the Alaska Peninsula, south winds 20 to 25 knots. Bristol Bay looking at southerlies at about 20. And then for Wednesday, high-end gales for Kodiak Island out of the east-northeast at 45 knots. The Alaska Peninsula north to northeast winds 20 to 30 knots, and northeast at 30 for Bristol Bay. Eastern Aleutians, west-northwesterlies at 20 knots, northwest 20 for Adak and Atka. And for the western Aleutians, small craft advisories, north to northwest winds 25 to 30 knots. And those come down a little bit on Wednesday there for the western Aleutians. North winds 20 to 25 knots, west 15 to 20 for Adak and Atka. And winds lightening up here for the eastern Aleutians, mostly out of the west there at 15 to 20 knots. And for St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, north winds at 20 tomorrow. That same forecast good for the Pribilof Islands. Gale warnings for St. Matthew Island, north winds 35 knots. And then for the day on Wednesday, we've got light winds now for Norton Sound, St. Lawrence Island, Yukon Delta coast, all 10-knot winds there. North at 20 knots for Kamishak Bay, or the Kuskokwim Delta coastline there. Not Kamishak Bay, but Kuskokwim Bay and the Delta, or the coastline here, north at 20 knots for the Pribilof Islands. And up along the eastern central Beaufort Sea coast, you can see east and northeast winds at 25 knots. So brisk wind advisories all along the coastline develop into a gale here as you get down southwest of Point Lay through the Chukchi Sea north, 40 to 45 knots for Tuesday. And then for Wednesday, brisk wind advisories for the Chukchi Sea, winds down to 25 knots, still out of the north. And northeast winds at 15 knots for the western Arctic coast. And the central and east side, looking at east to northeasterlies at 10 to 15 knots.